So, welcome everyone. Welcome to Write a Book That Gets You Booked. Booked on what? Well, the big buzzword today, everybody wants to get on that red circle, on that TED stage or that TEDx stage. And I'll tell you from personal experience, speaking at TEDx revolutionized, changed my life. It was a game changer for me. I had the pleasure of speaking at TEDx twice. And whenever people ask me how I got booked on TEDx, they always expect some sort of magic formula, some way of breaking into the algorithm of the TED organization in order to get placed in there. And my answer is always almost a little counterintuitive or disappointing for some people who want a magic formula. There is no magic formula. I got booked on TEDx because the organizers of the TEDx were looking for people who were speaking about the thing that their TEDx, the vision of their TEDx, the idea of their TEDx. So one of my TEDx was about mental health and specifically women's mental health. So my book, Brave Ecstatic Woman, was exactly about that. And so the TEDx organizers actually sourced me out, actually found me because they were already familiar with what it is I was speaking about. My second TEDx came after my daughter and I had written a book, and I had organized a huge autism initiative, an aviation flight that had kids on the autism spectrum come to the airport and go through the boarding gates and through security and down to the plane, where they all got to enjoy a taxi aircraft flight around the airport without ever leaving the ground. Well, the organizers were looking for people who were doing some big things, big initiatives in the way of having people change the paradigm or change the vision of how they saw people, children, and neurodiversity, and how people can really take everyday experiences and make them really special. And so they found me. So the key is that in both situations, it was a book that got me booked. Since then, I've worked with so many authors who want to break into the TEDx stage, and rarely is it that the TEDx stage comes before the book. And in the slim chance that it is, a book comes very shortly afterwards, because guess what? A TEDx experience or a TED experience can skyrocket your career. A TEDx experience, for instance, so you want to speak at TEDx? I mean, what does that do for you, for your career? What doors does it open up? TEDx is one of the best experiences that any author can have. Not only do you get to reach millions of people, not only do you get to reach the people who are in the audience at that time, but also, as you know, TEDx videos get uploaded onto the TED platform on YouTube, and millions of people go to watch TED. That's become the staple, the name that's synonymous with expertise, big ideas, innovations, technology, creativity. You run the gamut of any expertise, you can find it on TED.com. And TEDx speakers now get to have a platform that is TED.com. So it can skyrocket your initiatives, skyrocket everything that you want to say. I'll give you some examples of people who really skyrocketed their careers with TEDx talks. For instance, Drew Dudley, he had an idea, just a simple idea, and he actually mentions it on the front of his book. The TEDx that he gave was in Toronto in 2010, and it was a story that he told about years before. He had inspired a young undergraduate student who was coming to university and was feeling a lot of anxiety, and he gave her a lollipop and inspired her to give it to someone else. And years later, she remembered that. And that was his leadership lesson. And he went on to have some great success in leadership and organizational leadership because of that TEDx, simple, humorous TEDx. Another example, of course, as we all know, a TEDx can really have people fall in love with your big idea. As you know, Brene Brown came in as a researcher, as a social worker doing some very important things in the world, but she wasn't a household name until her TEDx skyrocketed her in celebrity status with the message of vulnerability and how shame affects us, and in fact, the gifts of imperfection. Well, TEDx booked her because of the stories that she gave in this book. The Gifts of Imperfection actually came out in the same year that her TEDx was booked, and it was part of her PR campaign, her public relations campaign for the book. And now we know Brene Brown has gone on to write so many books, but it began with a book, with a simple idea in a book. Of course, speaking at TED can open so many doors. As we all know, Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote a travel memoir as her first book, became hugely successful with the book. But when she spoke at TED, it wasn't about the travel memoir. She wasn't speaking about the original book. She was bringing a whole new idea. She was opening new doors in her career to now talk about creativity and the process of being creative and how that is a magical process. And she opened up so many doors, not only for herself, but for her readers, to really epitomize her, to benchmark her as the voice of creativity for a new generation. Then, of course, a TEDx can launch your career. As we know, Simon Sinek's Start With Why, it's probably one of the most watched TED Talks to date. And it all started because he had this simple question that he actually encapsulated in a book that then he went on to have astronomical success because he brought the idea from his book onto the TEDx stage. Speaking at TED can create instant credibility. As we know, having a book for Brian Stevenson and then sharing that on the TED stage catapulted him, not only his story, but the story of all of the justice that he represents in the legal field, in the law and justice field in the US. He created a movement based on his credibility, not only as the book itself, but this book also became a movie. So not only does the book open the door for the TED experience, the book also opens the door for the movie experience. But what else can a TED Talk do? Well, it can start a movement that reaches millions and millions of people. The 5-second rule by Mel Robbins is a big idea that needed to be shared. It started with a book and then became, had the propulsion because of the TED Talk. Mel Robbins became the hero of this very simple big idea because of her TED Talk. And of course, speaking at TED creates connection. James Clear was this lovable character speaking about habits. Now, there are millions of books written about habits, but James Clear wrote a book and became such a lovable personality that people gravitated to his book, his TED Talk, because he created that connection with the audience. And so now the audience really got why making small, tiny, incremental, atomic habits could help them in their life. And that's why Atomic Habits is one of the best-selling books in the world and has been for a few years. Most importantly, though, speaking at TED is living your legacy. One of my favorite books. And if you haven't yet read it, I highly encourage you to do so. Eddie Jaku. the happiest man on earth, an Auschwitz survivor. He gave his TED talk and wrote his book on the ideas and the life lessons he learned while he was a youth living through the Second World War and Auschwitz. And in fact, he is the happiest man on earth because he learned how to be. And he teaches how, not only in his TED talk, but in his book. Well, the incredible thing is that just shortly after the TED talk went viral, as well as the book was released, Eddie Jaku passed away at just shy of his 100th birthday. So a TED talk and a book becomes memorialization. It lets more people know about your story than a book by itself can do. But what do all of these TED Talks have in common? They all began with a book. Even the head of TED, Chris Anderson, wrote a book about the official TED Guide, about TED Talks. Even Ted Anderson, the head of TED, considers that it's important to write a book about how to do the thing that he's famous for. It goes together. TED Talks, TEDx Talks, and books go together. In order to be found by TED or TEDx, if you've already written a book that gets you booked on TEDx because the organizers are looking for specifically that, you've already got one foot in the door. You've already, actually not just one foot in the door, you've got an arm, a leg, a full body through the door. You've opened that door where before it was closed, because the organizers are looking for people who have a very specific idea, who have a very specific idea that's worth sharing. And that's how you get booked on TED. So as Chris Anderson says in his book, it begins with a big idea, an idea worth sharing. And an idea worth sharing always begins with a book. You encapsulate everything that you want to say within the pages of the book. So everyone's question, what does it take to get on the TEDx stage? How do you encapsulate the exact thing that the organizers are looking for, whether it's in your TEDx application or in the book that you're writing to get onto TEDx? Well, great question. First of all, it's idea building. It's not just a single idea that you'll be putting in your book or putting forward. It might turn out that way by the time you've created the 18-minute speech, which is the length of a TEDx or TED speech. But when you're writing your application or your book, it's actually idea building. One idea builds on the next idea. You start with one big idea. In book writing, I call this the premise to the promise. One big idea, and you have the reader or the listener get from that big idea to the end result. How do you get there? Well, you build connection. Like we saw with some of the examples of the books before, they were building credibility, connection, persuasion, and getting personal. Sharing their personal stories, sharing their personal experiences on how they understood some of these concepts. They told stories. There is a power in parables. There is a power that's gone on before we've existed. While we were hunter-gatherers gathered around the fire, we would tell stories. It's part of our human element, the irresistible power of parables. Explanation, because some of these concepts are bigger than stories can actually tell, but here's the caveat, here's the difference. You've got to explain some tough concepts, but you never want to have the curse of knowledge You don't want to talk at people. You want to have them connected with you. Persuasion. Well, those are the tactics of persuasion that you're priming it for someone to say, that's plausible. Well, and it might even be possible. And as you continue to tell your speech or write your book, you'll have your readers, your listeners say, well, that is now starting to sound probable. And then they're on the journey with you to revelation. And that's where they have a new narrative, where you have supplied your reader, your listener, with a new concept, a new way of seeing your big idea through your eyes, because you've taken them on this journey. So, how do you write a book that instantly gets you booked on TED? How do you write that single book that not only appeals to the masses and to your market, but also to the TED organizers, the TEDx organizers? Well, that is exactly what I do in my course, From Book to Booked. We look at a 6 weekly modules jam-packed full of taking you from every aspect, from the creation phase, the big idea, all the way to becoming the authority phase. I walk you through step by step, working with the power of your author archetype. Are you more like a Liz Gilbert or a Brene Brown or an Eddie Jaku? There are different messages, different persuasive elements that you're going to give based on your specific archetype. And within my program, you get to find out exactly which one you are and work to your strengths so that your big idea gets established in the strongest possible way. You get the power of connection. You get to understand that it's not just the parables and the stories that you need to tell. You need to relate it to the reader's mind so that they go from plausible, possible, to probable in whatever it is that you're trying to relate. There's a through line in a speech and a book, and it has to take the audience from the premise to the promise, and that is the power of connection. And I teach you exactly how to do that in this program, From Book to Booked. You find out exactly what it is to supercharge the power of your persuasion with just the right stories and wisdom, the information, the structure of it, the formula, the framework, so that you're positioning yourself as the go-to expert, the subject matter expert, the SME, the authority in your niche, in your market, on your topic. And as you do that, you're building your story bank. In an 18-minute speech, most speeches follow a framework that has 3 stories interwoven. But how do you choose those stories? And if you were given another booking, another stage where you only had 5 minutes, how do you choose those stories? How do you make your stories the most impactful stories? Well, as you're writing your authority book, your thought leader book, your subject matter expert book, your expertise book, you're starting to build those stories, those tangible parables, the power and the allure of your stories that we're honing in from your life and from the life of role models and people who you've come in contact with, who you know, and who have inspired you to come to the place where you've become the expert in your field. All of that, we are writing your book on the basis of the Swift method, which I created. It's a surefire way, not only to have your book become a bestseller, but also to have the organizers at TED and TEDx take notice, understand that you have the framework of what they're looking for TEDx and TED stage, to stand on that little red circle so that your book speaks before you even do. So that you're booked on TEDx without even having to apply, without having to knock on any doors, without having to push or pull or challenge to try to get it. You're actually catalyzing, you're supercharging your TEDx application, because as soon as your organizers see that you have a book, they take you as an expert, an authority, and a niche in your field. They understand that what they're going to get from you is those stories, those wisdom, that information, that formula, all of it from book to booked. All of it comes in this 6-week program. I'd love to see you in there. Click on the button below and have your book written from book to booked, and I'll see you on that TEDx stage. Until then, write on.